Well, good afternoon again, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's session of the first day of the Libertarian Alliance Conference 2009. I'm David Farrer, the Finance Director of the LA, proudly cash flow positive for 40 years. Our speaker today reminds me of the old days of the LA. Some of you younger folk may not believe this. At one time there was no such thing as the internet, and we had to read out libertarianism in the written word, and a lot of those words were produced by the Institute of Economic Affairs. There's a man called Arthur Selden there who used to produce a vast quantity of stuff which we used to devour in the pre-web days. And our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Richard Wellings, who is the Deputy Editorial Director of the IEA. And the subject he has to talk about this afternoon is the state the Treasury is now in, probably not as good as that of the LA, the urgent need for a rediscovery of the private supply of public goods. So please welcome Richard Wellings.
Thank you very much, David. Now, I think as people are becoming increasingly aware, Britain now faces its worst ever peacetime fiscal crisis, at least going back as far as economic records go back. In the first part of this talk, I'm going to briefly set out the scale of the problem, then actually explain why it's actually even worse than most people think, and then go through some of the likely consequences, which include a greatly increased likelihood of high or even hyperinflation. So I'm going to argue it's pretty bad, but it's looking more positively, it's not quite time to sort of retreat to the backwoods with a gun and some cans of food and a Bible, but it's still looking pretty grim. In the second part of the talk, I will look at a more positive aspect of the crisis, that the next government will be forced by economic circumstances to reassess the scope of government. There's a real opportunity for libertarians to seize the political agenda and to come up with some radical ideas for the private supply of so-called public goods and services. And for this, I've used a sort of wide definition of public goods for the purpose of this lecture, rather than the sort of narrow economic definition. So first, the scale of the problem. Well, back in the budget, the 2009 budget in April, we saw that the Treasury projected that this year the government will need to borrow about 170 billion, which is a shocking 12.5% of GDP, and then that will go up in the next financial year to 173 billion, and then it's looking at sort of roughly 150 billion for the 3 years afterwards, which is sort of scary territory. Now, unfortunately, this was based on rather optimistic growth forecasts of minus 3.75 in 2009, plus 1 in 2010, and plus 3.25 in 2011. And especially in the light of the recent data, this doesn't look very particularly likely. So what if, for example, we have much lower growth, say minus 5 this year, flat in 2010, say 1% in 2011, which is perfectly feasible. Then we're actually looking at £200 billion a year of government borrowing for the next 3 years, which is about 15% of GDP, which is higher than at any time since the Second World War, I would have thought. Now, to put that, obviously GDP has its faults as a measure. So if you look at it in terms of private sector output, it's about 30% of private sector output, which is unbelievable. Another way of looking at it, it means that about 1 in 3 of every pound the government spends is actually going to be borrowed. So it's going to be very difficult to fund this. They're going to have to issue about 220 billion of gilt government bonds in 2009 to 10, the financial year, according to the government. Now I'm going to argue, right, grim as that sounds, it's actually even worse than that. We've got quantitative easing. I can't actually remember the latest authorised figure. I think it's possibly 175 billion, but it's likely to go a bit higher than that. Now, eventually that will have to be reversed. Obviously, they increase the monetary base, and if the fractional reserve banking process starts acting on that, then you could have a huge explosion of lending and with obvious risks for purchasing power. So when they have to reverse this, it's conceivable that the government will have to borrow the 200 billion, then the bank will actually be selling an additional 100 billion on top, so we're looking at 250, 300 billion perhaps in a year, which is scary stuff. I mean, I'm not sure how we're going to raise these sorts of amounts without some kind of funding crisis or sky-high interest rates, or some kind of regulatory change that forces institutional investors to put more money into gilts. So once again, scary territory. And it's difficult to predict the inflationary effects of such high levels of borrowing, but we can say, looking back at history, that high budget deficits have often been followed by periods of high inflation. Now, of course, we have the Bank of England tasked to control the decline in purchasing power through inflation targeting. But as with any other form of central planning, it's likely to fail. And the dominant doctrines of monetarism and Keynesianism both share a fundamental error in analysing the recession in terms of volumes rather than patterns. So they tend to reinforce patterns of malinvestment rather than allowing the process of liquidation to run its course. Now, the bank bailouts probably count as an example of this kind of approach. It's difficult to quantify the effect on public borrowing, though the government has effectively guaranteed to bail out banks that run into difficulties. Now, the liabilities of the three biggest high street banks each exceed the annual GDP of the UK, and the government's own asset protection scheme covers about 585 billion. I think RBS and Lloyds are members of that. So if there are large falls in asset prices in the medium term, then this could actually be even more disastrous for public finances. There are also a series of long-term structural problems hitting home. There are the public sector pensions. A recent estimate was 1.3 trillion of liabilities, equivalent to 100% of UK GDP. And obviously the burden on current expenditure will rise gradually over the next few years. There's the state pensions, another trillion of liabilities to current pensioners, another 1.2 trillion to future pensioners, and these are based on NI contributions, which mean they're very difficult for the government to get out of paying. So even before the recession began, the UK public debt sort of measured on standard accountancy terms was more like 4 trillion or 300% of GDP. On top of that, we've got an ageing population, the baby boomers hitting retirement, extra pressure on the NHS, local authorities for care homes, etc. I think it's also worrying from a public choice point of view in that the average voter will be 52 in 2015, which is going to make them more likely to vote for higher spending on old age benefits. And we've already seen a series of election bribes for this sort of age group, like the free bus passes, pension credits, TV licence and fuel allowances, etc. It's going to make pension reform very difficult, and also it's going to make it very difficult to cut the benefits that accrue to these age groups, like I think something like half the incapacity benefit claimants are over 50. Now, on top of all that, we've got environmentalism, which has now been embraced by the British Conservative Party. We have a huge raft of legislation, mostly from Brussels, in the pipeline, which will drown our businesses in regulation, lowering profitability, economic growth and tax revenues. By 2020, about £200 billion will have to be invested in the electricity industry alone just to meet climate change targets. On top of that, about 100 billion will need to be invested in the water industry, mostly to meet EU directives. All this will suck huge amounts of capital out of the productive part of the economy. A further factor is oil, North Sea oil revenues declining in the UK. Some talk about peak oil. I'm a bit sceptical about that, but probably we won't see the sort of increase in consumption that's been possible in the past, particularly because it will be constrained by environmental legislation. So all these factors put together will make it far more difficult for the public finances to recover in the next decade. Now, I'm going to go on to talk about funding the debt. Where will the 200 billion plus per year come from? Well, it could come from abroad, from, for example, the sovereign wealth funds with $1.5 trillion in assets. But the problem here is that other countries will be borrowing huge amounts at the same time as the UK government, including the US, of course, with the projected well, 1.7, 1.8 trillion annual deficits over the next few years. So the UK can really only expect a small share of this money. UK pension funds, insurance companies, etc., they have enough capital to fund the government debt, but this would mean putting a large share into relatively low-yielding gilts, government bonds, and the crowding out effect of this would reduce long-term economic growth and also tax revenues. Perhaps pretty likely is an IMF loan, but once again, if other countries are tapping the IEA for money, then there could be limits on this. And finally, the politicians' old trick, which is to print money to pay off debt, which is probably the most worrying possibility. But now we've sort of broken the taboo with quantitative easing, it's not impossible. And of course, if there's even a small risk of high inflation in the future, then buyers of gilts will demand a risk premium, which it actually could threaten a debt spiral as the government struggles to pay off its own interest payments on its debt. So it might have to pay a higher and higher share on interest payments, which then will encourage it to print money, of course. Now, amongst the general public, there's also a danger when inflation expectations rise of what Mises called a flight to real goods or a crack-up boom. This is when people expect inflation to devalue their currency, so cash becomes like a hot potato. They try and get rid of it, and as quickly as possible. And in the jargon, this increases the velocity of money rapidly, so each pound does a lot more work in terms of purchasing goods. And this is how inflation can quickly get out of control. And it can lead to hyperinflation if the government doesn't sort of cut back on spending if it continues to monetize debt. So I think this scenario is unlikely at the moment, but I think if we had some kind of external shock that maybe pushed the price of oil up, this wouldn't necessarily cause inflation, but in public choice terms, it would make it much more difficult for politicians to say cut welfare benefits if people couldn't afford to heat their homes. And the temptation might be, in the context of political unrest, the possibility of political unrest or political instability, that they could be tempted to monetize debt rather than have some kind of turmoil. But as I say, it's pretty unlikely unless we get some kind of external shock. So in summary, government borrowing has now reached alarming proportions, and emergency action is needed to reduce it and avoid some of the nightmare scenarios that have been outlined. So what are the solutions? Well, certainly not the 25 billion of cuts every 5 years recently proposed by George Osborne, the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is nowhere near enough. Now, other Tory proposals like cancelling ID cards, the NHS IT scheme, Crossrail, abolishing the regional assemblies, these will help a bit and they're worthwhile in themselves, but they'll still only really scratch the surface. And raising taxes won't do it either. So measures like the 50% top rate of income tax are likely to be counterproductive in revenue terms, through their effect on work incentives, investment, foreign companies moving out of the city and the rest. In reality, to get the public finances onto a sound footing, we actually need cuts of maybe 100 billion to 150 billion per year in public spending. This means cutting nearly 1 in 4 pounds of money the state spends, and in practice this can only be done by attacking the main areas of government spending, so health, welfare and education in particular. Actually, I think that the situation is so dire that I believe there will actually be a need for emergency cuts very soon, the kind of thing we've seen in countries like Iceland, Ireland and Latvia. However, in the medium term, there's an opportunity to sort of tackle it more systematically through a downward shift in the role of the state. And I'm now going to run through some examples of how this might be done. But I can only touch on them briefly in the amount of time available. Let's start with higher and further education, which costs the taxpayer something like 20 billion per year. I think the state could withdraw completely from these sectors, with universities and colleges regaining their independence and allow to set fees as they choose, and also provide scholarships for poor and bright students. Obviously, with the technology today, many courses could be provided virtually free of charge over the internet, and in the absence of a government role, I'm sure an ultra-low-cost sector could develop. There's also scope for this kind of change in schools, but this is harder politically. I mean, I think ideally schooling would be made voluntary, but at the very least, supply-side constraints such as planning controls on schools could be lifted to give a low-cost private sector the room to develop. The NHS, of course, is probably the hardest nut to crack, especially given the ageing population, which will make cuts very difficult. As with education, a potential way forward is to remove constraints on the supply side to allow a low-cost private sector element to develop. And the sort of controls I'm talking about are immigration controls on doctors, the stranglehold of the General Medical Council on the medical profession, prohibitions on medicines and the trade in blood and organs, and so on. And actually, if you're interested in that topic, I would recommend the December 2008 edition of Economic Affairs, which Tim and Helen Evans contributed to, as well as Brian Micklethwaite. There are some excellent ideas in that edition. These sort of reforms would make it far easier for people to treat themselves rather than having to be a chronic burden on doctors. For example, if people could get their painkillers from the chemist rather than having to keep getting prescriptions, there could be huge cost savings. Especially if sort of recreational drugs like opiates and cannabis were also legalised at the same time, which of course would be good for other reasons as well. Welfare reform is another key area. There's now a consensus among the political elite that welfare reform is needed, but the proposals from the main political parties involve things like subcontracting out job centre services, workfare, that kind of thing, when in fact what's actually needed are actually substantial cuts in benefits, particularly the counterproductive child tax credits, which cost, well, tax credits as a whole cost about 15 billion a year, but they're mostly counterproductive, and also a housing benefit. And this, in the medium term, could be achieved by phasing out the role of the state and shifting to private insurance, higher savings, and support from the extended family as well as charities. The phase-out of housing benefits and social housing subsidies would save a huge 25 billion a year. And once again, here the key is to liberate the supply side by removing building regulations and planning controls, allowing ultra-low-cost housing to develop, such as the manufactured homes you see in the US. So it could be done if the political will is there. State and public sector pensions are another area where huge savings can be achieved. There is no good economic reason why they can be shifted to private sector. And of course, the burden of public sector pensions, which I mentioned earlier, would be shrunk enormously if the public sector itself was reduced. Finally, how about another round of privatisations? But not to bail the government out with flotation receipts and provide it with yet more money to squander, rather for efficiency gains and to reduce ongoing state spending in areas such as transport, defence and law and order. Take one example, the railways. Proper privatisation could eliminate the annual 7 billion of public subsidies, and also billions of pounds worth of valuable land could be released, which could be used for its most economic use. For example, corridors could be used as toll roads or for property development. So actually there are huge savings here from a programme of privatisation. And actually it's interesting that even David Cameron has mentioned the possibility of privatising the country's motorway network. So it shows that at least aspects of this agenda do have some political traction, and we can't expect the whole lot to sort of go into policy, but at least a few ideas could actually be implemented. In conclusion then, the fiscal crisis is now so severe that it risks undermining recovery and significantly increase the probability of nightmare scenarios such as hyperinflation. But the situation can be turned round with a radical programme of denationalisation and deregulation. A thriving entrepreneurial economy based on private provision can rise from the ashes of a fiscal crisis built on socialism and central planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We have, I can see 2 questions already. Are we using the microphones again?
Yes.
Yes, I think we have our microphone operatives coming up here. First one on the left, there, halfway back.
Hi Richard, Paul Cullen. One of the things I want to ask all the debt they've accumulated. The correct libertarian response, of course, is that we should simply default on this debt, deliberately so. I can't see a downside to it. It would certainly stop people being tempted to lend the government any more money. And if a government deliberately defaulted on the debt, it would cut out a lot of temptation, almost force them down the route that you were describing. Are there any downsides to defaulting on the debt that you might want to talk about, or is it all just good news to do that?
I mean, it's not something I've sort of thought about for this talk, because it's sort of too radical for what could happen in the sort of realm of political practice. I think actually you could well be right, but I think in the short term, obviously there would be a sort of difficult adjustment process as if you think about foreign investment flows would change enormously if the government did something like that, and there could be a loss of confidence in the UK in general. So I think you'd have a sort of few tough years, but in the long run you may well be right, it would be hugely beneficial. So I think that's all I can say on that, I haven't really thought about it deeply.
Thank you. There's a question right at the back. Is that Chris there? Yeah.
Sorry, it's a little more of a comment than a question. You mentioned the NHS IT programme, and the amount it costs, I mean, we're looking at possibly about £20 billion. I was looking at an old thing that someone trying to put £20 billion into perspective. Basically, the idea was that on the day Queen Victoria died, I go into the woods with a basket of used fibres and set fires to them. And I do that every single day until today. And I still haven't actually burned £20 billion. I've still got about 2 years to go. So it's just, we talk about colossal amounts of money, and just trying to put these colossal amounts of money into perspective is a very, very difficult thing, I think. When for most people, only £1 million, even over their lifetime, is almost unimaginable. And we've got government spending vast amounts of money. It has to stop, I think. That's it. Thank you.
I mean, one way to put it in perspective is to say how much it is per head, which I think is roughly sort of 350 quid per head of the population of the UK, so that can sort of bring it home.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a question in the light shirt there.
No, I work in the NHS in senior managerial position, and I have to agree that it can be a difficult thing to crack if you want to abolish it. It's been having very good PR for the last 60 years, and from this point of view, it's very difficult to crack. But on the other hand, with a bit of political will, you can run it easily at 50% cost. Because every health system, and particularly NHS, is over-regulated. Many things are expensive just because there are many, there is a need for formal contracts that involves 5 managers to work out these contracts. There are many things that make it expensive. And if you just abolish the European Working Time Directive, if you abolish certain regulations around the pharmaceutical market, just politically, you can run the service twice as cheap as now.
I mean, I think there's huge scope for savings, but the problem is the producer interest within the NHS is so powerful, and they will obstruct any changes that sort of threaten their well-being. So whether it can be done in practice is another issue. I mean, and we're drawing from the EU to get out of the EU directives is another big issue.
There's a question here on this side.
You mentioned the effect of top-end taxation of 50%, but you didn't look at the other end of the thing. If you take the minimum wage and you multiply the minimum wage by the working week and add in a bit for national insurance, it is not legal, if you're working full-time, to earn less than about £12,000 a year. Taxation kicks in at about £6,000 a year, and the result is that for a great tranche of the low-paid, they are at one and the same time paying tax, receiving some of it back from the government in form of credits and so on if you go through all the paperwork. You also find that that interlinks with the benefit system such that people at the bottom end of the scale are the ones that find themselves paying marginal tax rates of 90% plus in terms of every extra pound earned. And one of the aspects of the welfare state is that at the lower end of the scale, the incentives not to work are vast, precisely because you earn very, very little extra from your efforts. I wonder whether you care to comment on that in the context of your overall talk.
You're quite right, and I think part of the problem is to, for example, to raise the income tax threshold to £12,000 would cost around 19 billion, which is why governments are unwilling to do it, especially at the moment. I think I did mention housing benefit though, which is the biggest single problem in terms of the withdrawal rates. That's often the biggest benefit. I mean, some people in parts of London are entitled to, I think, £450 a week housing benefit for a one-bedroom flat, whereas for a three-bedroom they're allowed about £35,000 a year, so they're probably living next door to merchant bankers and that kind of thing. The housing benefit system is the real scandal, and if you got rid of the housing benefit, or at least make claimants pay a percentage of their rent out of their other benefits, that would make a big difference. I think it'd be difficult to cut job seekers from its £64 a week, because I think people are struggling now in the context of fuel and water bills inflated by environmental regulation. I mean, I actually think they should be abolished for libertarian reasons, but politically it would be virtually impossible. So I think, yeah, you're quite right, there should be more sort of effort on improving work incentives, but as I say, it's expensive, and the tendency, like with tax credits, to sort of just shift the sort of band where the incentives are pretty ropey, either upwards or downwards. So I think the best thing is actually just to go for absolute cuts in benefits, particularly housing benefit reform. Phasing out housing benefits is the key to that.
There's someone at the back in the centre there, yes.
Christopher Beavis, how long do you think it will take for the politicians or political leaders of our country to get to grips with, shall we say, the need perhaps to cut back on defence-related projects and perhaps even to scrap the Ministry of Defence and let the armed forces deal directly with things like supply requirements and research and development?
Well, I don't think defence can be excluded from the round of spending cuts, but having said that, it's obviously difficult when the government's so committed to foreign wars, and I don't really want to comment on that issue, but I think, I mean, you could even have sort of subcontracting to mercenaries of sort of defence tasks, but overall, my own personal view is that it's better to move to a sort of decentralised defence based on individuals and groups rather than having a centralised army, and I think that's very appropriate. I think, I mean, Afghanistan shows how hard it is to invade a country that's built on that sort of decentralised defence.
We take one at the very front here, followed by the one at the very back.
Thank you very much. Ben Cousin again. The first question about defaulting on public debt raised an issue which has not really, I think, yet been addressed. Yet it was, if I remember correctly, either Standard & Poor or Dun & Bradstreet who allegedly about 3 or so months ago suggested the possibility of downgrading the status of British government debt. Can we go into that general area a little bit more, because I think it might jonk minds sharply.
Well, it's not actually my area of expertise, but the problem is I believe if the rating is downgraded, then obviously investors will require a sort of risk premium, and that will put upward pressure on interest rates. And I think if you looked at the interest rate spreads a few months ago, there was actually quite a significant risk of default for UK debt factored into the spreads, and I think it's even higher for some of these countries in the Eurozone that are expected to possibly break off from the Eurozone, like Greece, where I think wage costs are now something like 150% of those in Germany, which doesn't seem sustainable for a low productivity country. So, you're right to focus on that, but I mean, possibly you could ask the same question to Anthony Evans tomorrow, who's more of an expert on that kind of thing.
Right at the back there.
Hi, James Tyler. A simple idea that I think I've heard before, so it's not my idea, but I've heard it somewhere before, of dealing with the problem that the baby boomers all retiring and so on, is just to incentivise them not to retire by saying 65, instead of being eligible, being forced to claim retirement, just allow their income to be completely tax-free. And that way they're all incentivised not to retire, not to claim on benefits, not to claim on pensions, and they just carry on working.
I think that's a good idea, and the problem at the moment is that people over 60 are entitled to these pension credits, which mean unless they sort of earn a good whack, then it's not worth them working at all. So there are actually disincentives for them to work over the age of 60, especially for people in the sort of bottom half of the sort of wage rates. So I think that your proposal would be a much better way of dealing with things.
Tom Burrows?
Question that follows on from the last point about pensions. One of the problems with privatising businesses, and I'm thinking very much even about the current sort of kerfuffle about the Royal Mail and other kind of businesses like that have been privatised in the past, like British Airways, is that the joke about British Airways or British Telecom is that they're pension schemes that have some aircraft. The pension liabilities, the actual deficit, the hole, the black hole in these schemes is actually bigger than the market capitalisation of some of these privatised companies. And so one problem that you would have to confront in privatising parts of the state is the pension liabilities that continue to hang like a ball and chain to these things. I'm not quite sure how you deal with it, but it is one of the problems with privatising parts of the state where they have very significant legacy liabilities. You can't just simply say, okay guys, you're in the private sector now, we're going to get you rid of all this, because there are contractual issues which any government interested in the rule of law has got to take some notice of.
Yes, but I mean, I suppose you could sort of allow them to go under these companies, in which case I think that the pension liabilities go under with them, and then allow new companies to come up in their place. That would be one answer, though it's not very nice for their sort of pensioners, to be honest. So, yeah, I don't know the answer to that. And I think another problem is that the privatisations so far have also ended up with a sort of heavily regulated structure of the industries, which means you've sort of lost a lot of the benefits of privatisation. So there are problems with the process once you get sort of politics involved, and as you say, the pensions issue is a huge problem in itself.
Perhaps I could ask you a question myself, Richard. The Labour Party tells us that the debt level in this country is nothing hugely to worry about because it's about the same as that in France and Germany. So I was wondering, is that so? Is what we should worry about the fact that it's accelerated very recently to that level? Or is it the case that the figures here aren't genuine and the off-balance sheet liabilities are higher here than they are in France and Germany?
I mean, more or less all the Western countries have similar off-balance sheet liabilities, so it's not that. What worries me is not sort of the overall level of debt in terms of the national debt going up from 50% to close to 100% of GDP. I mean, it is far higher than that in some other countries like Japan. I think it's 250% or so. And they've also got these unaccounted liabilities as well. What worries me is actually the timing, the huge amount the government has to raise in the short and medium term. This is what worries me, not the overall amount. These are two distinct problems.
Do you have any more questions? Anything from this side, perhaps? Well, thank you, Richard. Well, maybe I can think of another one quickly. Someone like myself, I'm an investor in British government gilts, so I have to confess, sorry Paul, in the index-linked funds, of course, which have gone up a lot in value. What would pension funds invest in if government defaulted? Do you think they're thinking about these things at all? Private sector pension funds, are they concerned about the government defaulting?
Well, I think one pension fund that is concerned with that is the Bank of England pension fund, because they've actually put a far higher share of their pension fund into index-linked gilts than previously. I mean, the problem is, part of the problem is that the regulatory environment for pensions, which I think over the last few years has forced them to put more money into so-called safe assets like gilts. And I would also say as Paul mentioned, there are sort of libertarian objections to investing in gilts in terms of it being a claim on sort of forced confiscation from taxpayers. So that's another issue as well.
Well, I saw it just as a way of getting my own tax back somehow, but we have a question at the back on this side.
The current government seems to be relying on growth forecasts returning to where they were pre-recession, or even increasing beyond that point. Do you think it's likely that growth will increase to the point where the debt becomes more, I don't want to say negligible, but where it becomes less of a concern than it is now?
I think that's very unlikely. I mean, I think possibly the financial sector in London could do pretty well, and that's completely unpredictable, but there's potential there. But manufacturing, for instance, is going to be hobbled by all the environmental legislation and the additional costs. Planning controls mean it simply can't grow beyond a certain rate in reality. I mean, people talk about spare capacity, but it's probably spare capacity in the wrong industries. They're looking, once again, at volumes instead of patterns. So I'm very sceptical. I mean, to digress, I mean, outside of London, you think about Scotland, Wales, the north of England, where 60–70% of the economy is state spending. Now, as that is cut over the next 10 years, the private sector in those areas would have to grow at, say, 5–6–7% a year just to keep things flat. So I think at least those areas are going to be in for a sort of long Japan-style stagnation at best.
We have another one here on this side.
You touched on this, but I almost want to encourage you to be a bit more explicit, hence my comment or question. The point about law and order is that it's actually very expensive to the state, not merely in the direct costs of policing, but also in things like revenue foregone, encouragement of the black economy, and so on. If a government were to pursue a fairly robust approach to trying to decriminalise or make fully legal and tax where appropriate victimless crime, and I include in victimless crime things like taking drugs and all the sex industry and all that goes with it, aspects of motoring and so on, isn't that actually quite a good way of achieving the sort of threefold hit: enlarging individual liberty, reducing the state, and both reducing the cost of the state and enhancing state revenues in particular contexts, like taxing drugs with a similar regime to alcohol and tobacco?
No, I completely agree with you. And I mean, the costs of crime are mostly actually private costs. The Home Office did a study, and as sceptical as I am about cost-benefit analyses, I think they came up with a figure of something like 40 billion a year for things like insurance and private security and all the rest of it. And then you've got the prisons are relatively cheap, I think 2 or 3 billion. The policing's a lot more than that, and the courts, etc. And I think outside London, probably nearly all crime, proper crime, I don't mean breaking EU directives on selling stuff in pounds, I mean traditional crime. That's nearly all related to drug addicts. It's probably different in London, but so yes, there are huge savings there. And I'd be a bit cautious about taxing recreational drugs though, because there's a danger then if you tax it too heavily, you wouldn't solve all the problems, you'd create new problems, and you still have the gangs involved, etc. So yeah, it's a great idea.
I think we have time for 2 quick questions, and is that Brian there, I see, and Chris again, I think, at the back. Oh, sorry, it wasn't Brian, was it? I can't see this far.
Sorry about that, it's Philip Dundon. Just listening to you, it occurs to me to ask two questions, or suggest one thing, that is that possibly the only way out is inflation. That way we don't have, none of us have to pay back what we owe in the same amount that we owe for the money. Those of us who do owe. And secondly, I accept that it will be different in different places depending on the economies and the currencies. But in the UK, how soon do you...
Well, I don't agree that inflation is the answer, because it acts as a hidden tax on holders of currency. So, and it's actually, in a sense, immoral, because it actually discriminates against those people who didn't invest in all these sort of bubble assets, etc. So it actually distorts the economic information, the signalling of information and knowledge in the economy. Of course, inflation does that anyway, not just in terms of previous investments. It destroys economic calculation. So it's generally a bad thing. From sort of the perspective of Austrian economics, it doesn't really help you with the timing of when this is going to happen. So, as I said, I think an external shock could easily bring on quite high inflation, but you've probably got to look at things like the money multiplier, how quickly the banks are starting to lend money, and there are statistics on that, but obviously it's always a few months behind. So if there's a sudden spike, then we could get into this sort of nightmare scenario where the velocity of money suddenly increases, and then the government has to somehow, or the Bank of England has to somehow, fight the fire with reversing quantitative easing, but it's not going to be easy.
Okay, so there's one final question.
Yeah, sorry. I just wondered, this might be slightly out of your area of expertise, but as far as I understand, when British companies deal with overseas companies, the government guarantees any credits or debts that they give. I think a credit default guarantee is the thing. Does that have a major impact on UK debt? And do you think that what's your position on that?
I don't know the exact figures. If anyone knows, then they, put your hand up and tell us. But I have a feeling it's not significant in the sort of overall scheme of things. So, and you obviously would have to have a huge level of default for it to become a big problem. But when you're talking about things like the asset protection scheme with 600 billion, I think it's relatively small change compared with that.
Thank you. Well, it's 2:45, so we have to call this session to an end. So I'd like everyone to thank Richard Wellings for a very excellent presentation.